The sun hammered down on Black Hollow like a punishment from an indifferent sky, turning the dirt roads into powder that coated everything it touched. Maravale could taste that dust now, gritty between her teeth, mixing with the copper tang of blood from where she'd bitten her lip, trying not to scream. Her knees dragged through the main street, tearing open against rocks and debris. The rope around her wrists had already rubbed the skin raw, and every few feet Deputy Harris would yank the line just to watch her stumble forward. "Keep moving, Mara," he called back, his voice carrying that particular brand of cruelty that came from a small man given a little bit of power. Folks paid good attention to come see this. Don't disappoint them now. The boardwalks on either side of the street were packed. It seemed like the entire town had turned out for the spectacle. Women in their Sunday dresses despite it being Thursday, men who should have been working their claims or tending their shops. Even the children had been let out of school early for this, a special lesson in what happened to women who didn't know their place. Mara kept her eyes down, watching the dust cloud around her torn skirts. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Not now. Not after everything else they'd already taken from her. "There she goes," someone shouted from the crowd. "The cursed widow herself." "Should have run her out months ago," another voice added. "Nothing but bad luck since Jonah died." Jonah. Her husband's name hit her like a physical blow even now, 2 years after they'd buried him in the frozen ground on the hill outside town. The winter that killed him had been brutal, temperatures so low that water froze solid in pumps, and men working outside lost fingers to frostbite in under an hour. Jonah had been checking the fence line when the storm rolled in. They found him 3 days later, half buried in a snowdrift, his lips blue and his eyes still open. The town said he'd gotten lost in the whiteout. Mara had her doubts, but what could she do? She was just his wife, just a woman, just someone who'd failed at the one job frontier wives were supposed to master, staying alive long enough to give their husbands sons. "Barren bitch!" The insult came from Martha Hendricks, the seamstress who used to be friendly before Jonah died. Now Martha stood on the boardwalk with her 3 children clustered around her skirts, her face twisted with disgust. 2 years married and not even a pregnancy to show for it. Mara's jaw tightened. That particular wound never quite healed, no matter how many times they pressed on it. She'd wanted children desperately, had prayed for them in the quiet moments before dawn, had tracked her cycles on a calendar hidden in her dresser, had done everything the old women in town suggested. Nothing worked. And after Jonah died, the whispers started. Maybe God knew she wasn't fit to be a mother. Maybe that's why her womb stayed empty. Deputy Harris stopped suddenly, and Mara nearly crashed into his boots. They'd reached the center of town, right in front of the general store where she used to buy flour and coffee back when shopkeepers would still take her money. "Reckon this is a good spot," Harris announced to the crowd. He pulled on the rope, forcing Mara to her knees in the dirt. "Everybody gets a nice clear view." The crowd pressed closer, forming a tight circle around her. Mara could smell them, sweat and tobacco and the particular sour-sweet scent of people feeding on someone else's misery. Thomas Crawford, the town's self-appointed moral authority and owner of the largest grain operation in the valley, stepped forward. He wasn't wearing his usual work clothes. Instead, he dressed in a dark suit like he was going to a funeral. Maybe he was, in a way. This was supposed to be the death of Maravale's presence in Black Hollow. "Maravale," Crawford began, his voice carrying across the silent crowd, "you stand accused of being a burden on this community. Since your husband's death, you have failed to maintain his property. You have failed to contribute to the town's welfare. You have brought nothing but misfortune and discord to Black Hollow." Mara looked up at him, finally meeting his eyes. Crawford flinched slightly, just a tiny movement, but she caught it. Interesting. For all his big talk, he didn't like it when she looked directly at him. "The council has decided," Crawford continued, recovering his composure, "that you will be publicly humiliated as punishment for your failures, after which you will have 3 days to leave Black Hollow permanently. Your husband's property will be sold to pay his outstanding debts, and you will take nothing with you but the clothes on your back." "Debts?" Mara's voice came out rough, barely more than a whisper. She hadn't spoken in hours. "Jonah didn't have any debts." Crawford's face hardened. "Are you questioning the council's accounting, Mrs. Vale?" "I'm saying my husband paid his bills on time, always did. Never owed a penny to anyone." "Then perhaps you don't know your husband as well as you thought." Crawford smiled, and there was something ugly in it. Perhaps there were aspects of Jonah's life he kept from you, business arrangements you weren't privy to. Mara wanted to argue, wanted to demand proof, but what was the point? They'd already decided her fate. This whole spectacle was just entertainment for people who had precious little of it in their hard lives. A child's voice cut through the tension. "Why is she on the ground, Mama?" "Hush now," came the mother's reply. "You just watch and learn what happens to women who don't behave proper." Mara closed her eyes. This was it. This was how her story ended, kneeling in the dust while children learned to hate her, while neighbors who'd once borrowed her sugar and invited her to quilting circles now watched her public destruction without a shred of mercy. The humiliation went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes. People shouted insults. Someone threw a rotted tomato that splattered against her shoulder. A young man she didn't recognize made crude jokes about what Jonah must have thought, being married to a woman who looked like she'd eaten 2 wives instead of being one. That got huge laughs. Mara's size had always been a source of shame in Black Hollow, where respectable women were supposed to be delicate and small. The fact that she was tall and broad-shouldered and heavy through the hips and thighs, that her body was built for hard work rather than fitting into the tiny waists fashion demanded, this made her fundamentally unacceptable in their eyes. Deputy Harris eventually stood up from where he'd been sitting on a barrel, enjoying the show. "All right, folks, I think Mrs. Vale has learned her lesson. Time to wait." The single word cut through the noise like a knife. The crowd went instantly silent, heads turning to find the source of the voice. 2 small figures pushed through the wall of adults. Twin girls, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with matching brown braids and identical dresses in faded blue calico. They moved with the determination of children who hadn't yet learned that the world could stop them. Mara's chest tightened. She knew these girls. Everyone in Black Hollow knew them. They were Rowan Creed's daughters, the mountain rancher who lived in the northern valley and came to town maybe once a month for supplies. Creed was the kind of man people whispered about but never confronted. Former military scout, they said. Fought in the territorial wars. Lost his wife in childbirth and raised the twins alone in that isolated ranch where winters could cut you off from civilization for months at a time. The girls reached Mara and did something that shocked the entire crowd into stunned silence. They wrapped their small arms around her, pressing their bodies against her like shields. "You can't hurt her," one of them said. Her voice shook, but she said it anyway. "It's not right." "She didn't do anything wrong," the other one added. "You're all being mean." Martha Hendricks gasped. "Those girls need to be removed immediately. Someone get them away from that woman before..." "Before what?" The voice that interrupted Martha was male, deep, and absolutely cold. Rowan Creed stepped into the circle. Mara had seen him before, of course, but always at a distance. Up close, he was even more intimidating than his reputation suggested. Tall and broad through the shoulders, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent in harsh conditions. His eyes were gray, the color of winter storms, and right now they were moving across the crowd with an expression that made several people take involuntary steps backward. "Papa said we could invite her," one of the twins said, looking up at Mara with eyes that were suddenly full of hope. "If we wanted." "He said we could help someone who needed help," her sister added. Crawford found his voice first. "Now see here, Creed, this is town business. The council has made its decision regarding Mrs. Vale, and I heard your decision." Creed's voice didn't rise, but somehow it carried to every person in the crowd. "Seems to me you've already delivered your humiliation. That was the punishment, wasn't it? Public shame?" "Well, yes, but..." "So it's done." Creed pulled a knife from his belt, a wicked-looking blade that had probably skinned more animals than Mara wanted to think about, and moved toward her. Several men in the crowd tensed, hands moving toward their own weapons, but Creed didn't even glance at them. He knelt beside Mara and cut the ropes binding her wrists with one quick motion. The blade was so sharp she barely felt it slice through the hemp. "Can you stand?" he asked her quietly. Mara nodded, not trusting her voice. Her legs screamed in protest as she pushed herself upright, and she would have fallen if Creed hadn't steadied her with one hand on her elbow. His grip was firm, but surprisingly gentle. The twins immediately pressed against her sides again, each one holding onto her skirts. "You can come home with us," one of them whispered. "We have extra space." "You can stay as long as you want," her sister added. "We could use help with lots of things." Mara looked down at these two small girls who had just done something incredibly brave and incredibly stupid, defending her in front of the whole town, going against the council's judgment. They had no idea what kind of consequences that might bring down on their family. "Girls," she started, her voice rough with emotion she was trying desperately to contain. That's very kind, but I couldn't possibly—" "You could," Creed interrupted. He was still standing close, still steadying her, and now he looked directly at Crawford. "The council wanted her out of her house. Fine. She's out. They wanted her punished. Fine. That's done. But nobody said she had to leave the territory completely." Crawford's face was turning an interesting shade of red. The intent was clearly— "Intent doesn't matter much in the frontier, does it?" Creed's expression didn't change, but something in his voice made Crawford stop mid-sentence. "What matters is what was actually said, what was actually done, and seems to me the council's demands have been met." Harris stepped forward, one hand resting on his pistol. "Mr. Creed, maybe you don't understand how things work here in town. The council has authority in town." Creed gestured at the buildings around them. "My ranch is 15 miles north. Last I checked, that's outside your jurisdiction." He paused, letting that sink in. "Way outside." The crowd was starting to murmur now, people exchanging glances, trying to figure out how this had suddenly shifted. They'd come for a simple humiliation and expulsion. This was becoming something else entirely. Martha Hendricks pushed forward. "This is highly irregular. Those girls need a proper mother figure, not some cursed woman who— My daughters just chose their mother figure." Creed's voice went even colder. "And they chose better than most of you deserve." One of the twins tugged on Mara's skirt. When Mara looked down, the girl smiled, a genuine, hopeful smile that broke something inside Mara's chest. "Will you come?" the girl asked. "Please?" Mara looked at the crowd, at Crawford's fury, at Harris's hand still resting on his gun, at Martha's scandalized expression, at all the people who had just spent the last hour teaching their children how to hate. Then she looked at Rowan Creed, the strange man who had just upended everything for reasons she couldn't begin to understand. "Why?" she whispered, quiet enough that only he could hear. "Why would you do this?" Something flickered in those gray eyes. Not quite warmth, but not quite the cold distance either. "Because my daughters asked. And because they've had precious few things worth asking for since their mother died." He paused. "And because what I just watched was chicken shit cowardice dressed up as justice." The crude language should have shocked her. Instead, it made her want to laugh, a slightly hysterical sound that she managed to swallow down. "I don't have anything," she said. "No belongings, no money, nothing to contribute." "You're standing upright after what they just did." Creed tilted his head slightly. "That's more than enough to start with." The twins were both holding on to her now, looking up with matching expressions of desperate hope. And Mara realized that saying no, walking away from these two small girls who had shown her more kindness in 5 minutes than Black Hollow had shown her in 2 years, would be a kind of cruelty she couldn't stomach. "All right," she said softly. "All right, I'll come." The girls actually cheered, small, bright sounds in the heavy silence. One of them grabbed Mara's hand, the other grabbed Creed's, and together, the 4 of them turned their backs on the crowd. "This isn't over," Crawford called after them. "The council won't stand for this defiance, Creed. You're making a serious mistake." Creed didn't even look back. "Wouldn't be my first." They walked through the silent crowd, which parted reluctantly to let them pass. Mara kept her head up this time, though every step sent fresh pain shooting through her torn knees. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her back, could practically hear the gossip already forming. But she also felt the small warm hand clasped in hers, and the solid presence of Rowan Creed on the other side. And she realized something that made her throat tight. For the first time since Jonah died, she wasn't alone. They reached the edge of town where Creed's wagon waited, a sturdy work vehicle hitched to 2 massive draft horses. He helped Mara up onto the bench seat with surprising care, then lifted each of his daughters into the back where they immediately started chattering to each other in excited whispers. As Creed climbed up beside her and took the reins, Mara glanced back at Black Hollow one last time. The crowd was dispersing now, people drifting back to their shops and homes. But she caught sight of Crawford standing in the middle of the street, staring after them with an expression that sent ice down her spine. That wasn't just anger on his face, it was fear. And Mara realized with sudden, terrible clarity, Crawford had wanted her gone for a reason that had nothing to do with being a burden on the town. Something about Jonah's death. Something about those supposed debts that had never existed. Something worth killing to keep hidden. "You all right?" Creed asked quietly as he guided the horses onto the north road. Mara touched her wrists where the ropes had been, feeling the raw skin beneath. "I will be," she said. And then, because she had to know, "Your daughters, they really asked to help me?" Emma saw what was happening from the general store window. Creed nodded toward the back of the wagon. She and Sarah, they started crying, said it wasn't fair, said somebody should stop it. He was quiet for a moment. They were right. "But you could have just stopped it. You didn't have to bring me home." "No," Creed agreed, "but the girls asked. And I've learned that when they ask for something that matters, really matters, I should probably listen." He glanced at her briefly. "They haven't asked for much since their mother died. Mostly they've just existed, quiet. Too quiet for children that age." "How long ago?" Mara asked softly. 4 years. Complications during the birth. She held on for 3 days, but he didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Mara understood loss. Understood the way it carved holes in your life that never quite filled in, no matter how much time passed. One of the twins, Emma, she thought, poked her head around from the back. "Are you really going to stay with us?" "For a while," Mara said carefully. "If your father agrees." "Papa already agreed," the other twin, Sarah, said firmly. "He wouldn't have brought you if he hadn't." "That true?" Mara asked Creed. He kept his eyes on the road. "My daughters need someone. The ranch needs work I can't do alone. You need a place where people aren't trying to destroy you." His jaw tightened. "Seems like a practical arrangement." "Practical," Mara repeated. The word felt heavy in her mouth. Not kind, not generous. Practical. She could work with practical. The wagon rattled on through the afternoon heat, leaving Black Hollow behind. With every mile, Mara felt some of the tension ease from her shoulders. The air smelled different out here, cleaner, without the stink of too many people packed too close together. The twins kept up a steady stream of chatter from the back, telling her about their ranch, their horses, their chickens, their dog named Bear, who was the best dog in the whole world. They talked over each other frequently, finishing each other's sentences in that way twins sometimes did. Mara listened, responding when appropriate, but mostly she was watching the landscape change. The flat scrubland near town gave way to rolling hills, then to steeper terrain marked with pine trees and rocky outcroppings. This was harder country, the kind of place that didn't forgive mistakes. "How far?" she asked Creed. "About another hour at this pace." He gestured ahead where the road began climbing toward a mountain pass. "Ranch is in the valley on the other side. Good grazing land, plenty of water from snowmelt. Gets cut off completely in winter, though. Once the first big storm hits, you can't get in or out until spring thaw." "Doesn't that get difficult?" "Depends on your definition of difficult." His mouth quirked in something that might have been a smile. "Town's difficult. Winter isolation is just quiet." Mara understood that sentiment more than she would have expected. The isolation of grief was different from the isolation of a mountain winter. But maybe they had more in common than not. Both required you to survive on your own resources. Both tested whether you were strong enough to endure. As they climbed higher, the temperature dropped a few degrees. Mara pulled her torn shawl tighter around her shoulders, wincing as the movement pulled at bruises she hadn't fully cataloged yet. "There's a blanket under the seat," Creed said without looking at her. "Wool. Should help." She found it, rough brown wool that smelled like horse and pine smoke, and wrapped it around herself gratefully. The warmth was immediate and desperately welcome. They crested the pass just as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The valley spread below them, bathed in golden light that made everything look softer than it probably was. Mara could see the ranch from here, a cluster of buildings nestled against the northern slope where they'd be sheltered from the worst winter winds. Barn, stables, what looked like a chicken coop, and a house that was bigger than she'd expected. "That's home," Emma announced proudly from the back. "It's the best house ever," Sarah added, "even though it gets really cold sometimes and the stove smokes if you don't open it just right." "The stove's temperamental," Creed admitted. "Has been since I built it. Haven't figured out the fix yet." I might be able to help with that, Mara heard herself say. Then she caught herself. I mean, I've worked with temperamental stoves before. Jonah and our first cabin had one that would smoke something terrible if you didn't. She trailed off, suddenly uncomfortable. But Creed just nodded. I'd appreciate the help. They descended into the valley as twilight settled in. By the time they reached the ranch, the first stars were appearing overhead, more stars than Mara had seen in years. Town lights washed them out, but here in the wilderness, the night sky opened up like a map of infinity. A massive dog came bounding out to meet them, Bear, presumably, barking with excitement. The twins tumbled out of the wagon and immediately swarmed the animal, who tolerated their affection with the patience of a creature who loved them deeply. Creed climbed down and came around to help Mara from the seat. Her legs had stiffened during the ride, and she nearly fell when her torn knees refused to hold her weight properly. He caught her easily, one arm around her waist. Easy, you're hurt worse than I thought. I'm fine, she said automatically. Then, because that was obviously a lie, I'll be fine. Sarah, go get the medical kit from the house, Creed called. Emma, take Bear and check that the chickens are locked up for the night. Both girls ran off to their assigned tasks without argument. Clearly they were used to following their father's instructions. Creed helped Mara toward the house. It was slow going, her body protesting every step, but she gritted her teeth and kept moving. She'd survived worse. This was just pain. Pain eventually faded. The interior of the house was dark until Creed lit a lamp. Warm light spread across a main room that was larger than her entire cabin in town had been. A big stone fireplace dominated one wall. A long wooden table sat in the center, surrounded by mismatched chairs. Shelves lined another wall, holding dishes and supplies. Everything was clean but worn, the kind of space that was lived in hard without much attention to decoration. Sit, Creed said, guiding her to one of the chairs. Mara sank into it with a relief that bordered on embarrassing. Now that she'd stopped moving, the full extent of her injuries was making itself known. Her wrists burned. Her knees felt like raw meat. Her shoulders ached from being wrenched by the rope. Even her jaw hurt from clenching her teeth to keep from screaming. Sarah returned with the medical kit, a battered wooden box that looked military in origin. Creed took it from her and knelt in front of Mara. This is going to hurt, he said matter-of-factly. Your knees are torn up pretty badly. I know. He began cleaning the wounds with water and some kind of strong-smelling solution that made her hiss in pain. His hands were surprisingly gentle for someone so large, his movements practiced. He'd done this before, probably countless times on himself, his daughters, his animals. Were you really a military scout? Mara asked, partly to distract herself from the pain. For about 6 years. Before that, I was just a farmer's son trying to escape working the family claim. He didn't look up from her knees. Army seemed like adventure. Turned out to be mostly boredom, punctuated by moments of terror. Is that where you learned medicine? Field medicine. Enough to keep people alive until you could get them to a real doctor. He wrapped clean bandages around her knees with efficient movements. Sometimes that's all you need. Emma appeared in the doorway. Papa, I'm hungry. Can we have supper? Creed glanced at the darkened kitchen area, and Mara saw something flicker across his face. Exhaustion, maybe, or resignation. I'll make something in a bit. I can cook, Mara said. The words came out before she'd really thought them through. All three of them stared at her. You're injured, Creed pointed out. My hands work fine, and cooking doesn't require much walking. She pushed herself to her feet, testing her weight on the bandaged knees. They hurt, but not unbearably. Besides, I should start earning my keep. You just got here. Then I should start immediately. Mara moved toward the kitchen area, taking in what was available. Dried meat hanging from hooks, flour and cornmeal in sealed containers, potatoes in a bin, some sad-looking vegetables that had seen better days. When's the last time you three had a proper meal? Creed exchanged glances with his daughters. Define proper. Something that's not dried meat and beans. Then probably a while. Mara nodded, already pulling ingredients down from shelves. Her body hurt, her emotions were shredded, and she had no idea what tomorrow would bring. But this she could do. Cooking was practical, useful, something she was genuinely good at, despite what the town had tried to make her believe about herself. All right, she said. Let's fix that. As she worked, mixing batter for cornbread, setting a pot of stew to simmer, finding actual seasonings that looked like they hadn't been used in years, Mara felt something shift inside her. Not hope, exactly. That would be too optimistic. But maybe the absence of despair. Maybe just the simple satisfaction of being useful again. The twins watched her with fascination, asking questions about what she was doing and why. Creed sat at the table, ostensibly cleaning his rifle but really just observing. The lamplight caught the planes of his face, and Mara noticed the deep lines around his eyes, the gray threading through his dark hair at the temples. He was probably only a few years older than her, but hard living had aged him. When the food was ready, she served it on plates that were chipped but clean. The first bite made Emma's eyes go wide. "This is really good," she said, sounding shocked. "It's just stew," Mara replied. "Papa's stew doesn't taste like this." Sarah was already reaching for seconds. Creed took a bite, and something eased in his expression. He didn't say anything, but he ate steadily until his plate was empty, then quietly accepted another serving. They ate in companionable silence. Outside, night pressed against the windows. Inside, the lamplight created a small sphere of warmth and temporary safety. After dinner, the twins helped clean up with the kind of practiced efficiency that spoke of established routines. Then Creed herded them toward bed despite their protests that they weren't tired yet. "You've had enough excitement for one day," he told them firmly. "Say goodnight to Mrs. Vale." "Good night, Mrs. Vale," they chorused. "Just Mara is fine," she called after them as they disappeared into what must be their bedroom. Creed lingered in the doorway for a moment, then came back to where Mara stood by the kitchen basin. "You should rest too. I've got a spare room. Used to be storage, but there's a bed. Mattress is probably dusty." "I've slept on worse." "I'm sure you have." He paused, seeming to struggle with something. Finally, "What happened today?" "What they did to you? That wasn't right." "No," Mara agreed quietly. "It wasn't. The girls seen it." His jaw tightened. "They shouldn't have had to see that." "But they did, and they helped anyway." Mara looked at him directly. "Why did you really bring me here? And don't say it's just because they asked." Creed was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower, rougher. "Because 4 years ago, I stood by my wife's bed and watched her die. And there was nothing I could do to stop it. Nothing. Just watch the life leave her eyes while she begged me to take care of our daughters." He looked away. "Today, I could do something. I could stop something bad from happening. So I did." The honesty of it, the raw, painful honesty, made Mara's throat tight. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once, then turned toward his own room. At the doorway, he paused. "The town won't let this go. Crawford and his people. They'll find a way to retaliate." "I know." "You're still willing to stay?" Mara thought about Black Hollow, about the hatred in those eyes, about Crawford's fear-tinged fury, about whatever secret Jonah had died protecting. "I'm still willing," she said. "All right, then." Creed studied her for another moment. "The spare room's through there. Holler if you need anything." He disappeared into his bedroom, leaving Mara alone in the lamplight. She found the spare room exactly where he'd indicated, a small space with a narrow bed, a single window, and hooks on the wall for hanging clothes she didn't have. The mattress was dusty, like he'd warned, but it was soft, and the blankets were clean. Mara sank onto the bed and finally let herself feel the full weight of everything that had happened. She'd been dragged through the streets like an animal. She'd been humiliated in front of an entire town. She'd lost what little she had left. But she was here, alive. In a house where 2 small girls had chosen her as worth defending, where a hard man had shown her unexpected mercy. It wasn't safety, exactly. It wasn't a solution. But it was shelter. And sometimes shelter was enough to start rebuilding from. Outside her window, she could hear the night sounds of the frontier, wind through pines, the distant call of an owl, the soft movements of animals in the barn. Tomorrow would bring new problems. Tomorrow, Black Hollow would start plotting its revenge. Tomorrow, she would have to figure out how to actually survive in this strange new life. But tonight, for the first time in 2 years, Mara Vale fell asleep without the weight of an entire town's hatred pressing down on her chest. And in the darkness, that felt like its own kind of miracle. Mara woke to the sound of something crashing in the kitchen, followed by a child's whispered curse word that would have made most mothers gasp. She lay still for a moment, disoriented in the unfamiliar darkness, her body screaming protests about yesterday's abuse. Then she remembered the ranch, Creed, the twins, the fact that she was no longer in Black Hollow. Pale pre-dawn light filtered through the single window. She pushed herself upright, biting back a groan as her bandaged knees reminded her exactly how badly they'd been damaged. The floor was cold against her bare feet. She'd slept in her torn dress, having nothing else to wear, and she limped toward the main room. Emma stood in the kitchen area, surrounded by what looked like the aftermath of an explosion. Flour dusted every surface. A broken egg dripped off the edge of the table. A pan lay overturned on the floor, and the girl's face was a portrait of guilty panic. "I was trying to make breakfast," Emma said quickly, her voice small. "Before Papa woke up. I wanted to surprise him, but I dropped the pan and then the eggs rolled off," and her eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry. I'll clean it up. I promise." Mara surveyed the disaster zone. "How long have you been out here?" "I don't know. A while." Emma wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of flour across her cheek. "I'm not good at cooking. Mama used to do it, and then after she died, Papa tried to teach us, but—" She gestured helplessly at the mess. "It's all right." Mara moved carefully into the kitchen, her knees protesting each step. "Here, let's clean this up together first, then I'll show you how to actually make breakfast without destroying the kitchen." Emma's face brightened immediately. "Really?" "Really, but first, that egg on the floor is going to start smelling if we don't get it up." They worked together in the quiet pre-dawn, Emma following Mara's instructions with intense concentration. The girl was clumsy but eager, and Mara found herself softening toward this small person who'd been brave enough to defend a stranger yesterday. "Why did you do it?" Mara asked as they wiped down the table. "Yesterday, I mean. Why did you and your sister come help me?" Emma was quiet for a moment, scrubbing at a particularly stubborn spot of flour. "Because it was wrong, what they were doing. Even I could see that, and I'm only 8. She looked up at Mara. "Papa says sometimes people do bad things because they're scared or angry, and it's easier to hurt someone than to fix what's actually wrong. He says that's how most wars start. Your father sounds like a wise man." "He is." Emma's voice carried fierce pride. "He's the best papa in the whole world. Even when he's sad, which is most of the time, he's still the best." Mara's chest tightened at that. Most of the time. What kind of life was that for children, growing up in a house where their father was perpetually grieving? By the time they'd restored order to the kitchen, Sarah had emerged from the bedroom, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She stopped in the doorway and stared at Mara like she'd forgotten overnight that they'd brought home a stranger. "You're still here," Sarah said. "I'm still here." "Good." Sarah climbed onto one of the chairs at the table. "Are you making breakfast?" "We are," Mara confirmed. "Your sister's helping me." Emma preened at that, standing a little taller. Together they made a real breakfast. Not the elaborate meal Mara would have preferred, given the limited supplies, but better than what these girls were probably used to. Eggs fried properly. Toast from yesterday's cornbread. Even some wild berries Sarah had apparently gathered the day before. Creed appeared just as they were setting the table. He stopped in the doorway much like Sarah had, taking in the scene with an expression that was hard to read. His hair was damp. He'd washed at the pump outside, probably, and he wore work clothes that had seen better days. "Morning," he said carefully. "Morning," Mara replied. "I hope you don't mind. Emma was already up, so we started breakfast." "Emma's up before dawn?" Creed raised an eyebrow at his daughter. "That's a first." "I wanted to help," Emma said defensively. "I can see that." Creed sat down at the table, and Mara noticed the way his movements were stiff. Old injuries, probably. The kind that never quite healed right. "Smells good." They ate together, the twins chattering about their plans for the day, while Creed listened with the patience of someone who'd learned to let his daughters fill the silence he couldn't manage himself. Mara caught him watching her a few times with that same unreadable expression. After breakfast, Creed pushed back from the table. "I've got work to do in the north pasture. Fence line needs repair before winter, and I'm already behind schedule." He looked at Mara. "You should rest. Your knees—" "My knees are fine," Mara interrupted. "Or fine enough. What needs doing around here?" Creed frowned. "You just got here yesterday after being dragged through the streets. You're hurt. I should start earning my keep." Mara stood up, testing her weight. It hurt, but she'd worked through worse. I'm not good at sitting idle, and if I'm going to stay here, I need to be useful. So what needs doing? The silence that followed was weighted with something Mara couldn't quite identify. Finally, Creed said, The chicken coop needs mucking out. Laundry's piled up. Garden's mostly dead, but might be salvageable if someone knows what they're doing with plants. He paused. But none of that's urgent. You don't have to eat. I want to. And she realized it was true. She needed to work, needed to feel useful, needed to prove to herself that she was more than what Black Hollow had tried to make her believe. Creed studied her for another long moment, then nodded. All right, but if your knees get worse, you stop. Deal? Deal? He left for the north pasture after giving his daughters a list of their own chores, feeding the chickens, collecting eggs, making sure Bear had fresh water. The moment he was gone, both girls attached themselves to Mara like barnacles. Can we help you? Emma asked. We're really good helpers, Sarah added, usually. Mara looked at these two small faces, so hopeful and desperate for attention, and felt something crack open in her chest. These girls had lost their mother young, had grown up in a house full of grief and silence, and now they were looking at her like she might fill some of that emptiness. It terrified her. All right, she said, keeping her voice steady. Let's start with the chicken coop. Fair warning, it's going to smell terrible. We know, both girls said in unison, then giggled at their synchronization. The chicken coop was indeed terrible. It clearly hadn't been properly cleaned in months, maybe longer. Mara rolled up her sleeves, her only sleeves, since this torn dress was literally all she owned now, and got to work. The twins helped as best they could, which mostly meant getting in the way while asking an endless stream of questions. How did you meet your husband? Did you always live in Black Hollow? Why were those people so mean to you? Do you know any good stories? Can you braid hair? Mara answered what she could, deflected what she couldn't, and slowly, painfully, began to understand the shape of the loneliness in this house. These girls were starving for female attention, for someone to talk to who wasn't their grief-locked father. They needed someone to teach them things about being women that Creed simply couldn't provide. By midday, the coop was clean, the eggs were collected, and Mara's knees were throbbing so badly she couldn't hide her limp anymore. Sarah noticed immediately. You're hurt, she said, her voice going small and worried. We should tell Papa. Your Papa's working. I'm fine. You're not fine. You're limping. Emma crossed her arms in a gesture that was pure Creed stubbornness. You said you'd stop if it got worse. I said I'd stop if my knees got worse. They're the same as they were this morning, which was technically true, even if misleading. Both girls looked skeptical, but they didn't push. Instead, they helped Mara back to the house where she finally, grudgingly, sat down to rest. Within minutes, Sarah had disappeared and returned with a worn book. Will you read to us? She asked, holding it out like an offering. Papa reads sometimes, but he falls asleep, and his voice gets all mumbly. Mara took the book, some adventure story about sailors and storms, and began reading. The twins settled on either side of her, their small, warm bodies pressed against hers, and something in Mara's chest pulled tight. This was what she'd wanted for years. Children to read to, children to care for, a family. But these weren't her children. This wasn't her family. She was just temporary help, a practical arrangement to solve mutual problems. She needed to remember that. Except the twins didn't seem to understand temporary. They listened to her read with rapt attention, asked questions about the story, begged for just one more chapter. And when Mara finally stopped, her voice getting hoarse, they both hugged her with the unconscious affection of children who'd already decided she belonged. Creed returned as the sun started its descent toward the horizon. He looked exhausted, his shirt soaked with sweat, dirt ground into every crease of his clothes. He stopped in the doorway and stared at the scene. Mara in the chair, both girls curled against her, the book open on her lap. They've been listening to stories, Mara said, suddenly feeling defensive. I hope that's all right. It's fine. His voice was rough. More than fine. The twins jumped up and ran to their father, talking over each other about their day. Creed listened, nodding, making appropriate sounds of interest, but his eyes kept drifting to Mara. She couldn't read his expression, but it made her uncomfortable in a way she didn't understand. That night, Mara cooked dinner again, a better meal this time, having found more supplies in the root cellar, some kind of stew with actual vegetables, bread that wasn't just cornbread, even a rough attempt at pie with dried apples she'd discovered. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Creed asked, accepting a second helping. "My mother, and then necessity." Mara cut into her own food, which hurt less than looking at him directly. When you're poor, you learn to make something out of nothing. When you're blamed for everything, you learn to be useful enough that people can't quite justify getting rid of you. The silence that followed was heavy. Finally, Emma said, "That's sad." "It is what it is," Mara replied. After dinner, after the girls had been sent to bed, Creed lingered again. He seemed to be making a habit of this, waiting until his daughters were asleep, then hovering awkwardly in the main room like he wanted to say something but couldn't quite figure out how. "The coop looks good," he said finally. "Better than it has in a year." "It needed doing. So do a lot of things." He gestured vaguely at the house. "I'm not great at the domestic stuff. Never have been. My wife, she managed all of that. And when she died," he trailed off. "I kept us alive, fed, safe. But I couldn't make it feel like a home, didn't know how." Mara understood what he wasn't saying. He'd been surviving, not living. Just like her. "The girls seem happy," she offered. "They are. Happier than I've seen them in years." He looked at her directly then, and there was something raw in his expression. "You did that in one day. I just cleaned a chicken coop and read them a story. You made them laugh. You answered their questions. You didn't treat them like burdens or mistakes or reminders of loss." His jaw tightened. "That's more than I've managed in 4 years. You're being too hard on yourself." "Am I?" Creed moved to the window, looking out at the darkness. "I kept them fed and clothed and safe from physical harm. But I couldn't." He stopped, struggling with words. "I loved my wife. When she died, something in me died with her. And I know that's hurt my daughters, but I don't know how to fix it." Mara didn't know what to say to that kind of honesty, so she said the only truth she had. "You brought me here. That's something. Because they asked. But you listen. That matters." Creed turned back to face her. "The town's going to come after us. You know that, right? Crawford and his council, they won't let this stand." "I know." "You could still leave. I could take you to the next territory over, give you enough money to start somewhere else. Somewhere safer." Mara thought about that. Thought about running again, starting over again, being alone again. "Is that what you want?" "What I want doesn't matter." "It does to me." Mara stood up, ignoring her protesting knees. "You gave me shelter when I had nothing. Your daughters showed me kindness when an entire town showed me cruelty. I don't walk away from that easily. Even if staying puts you in danger? I've been in danger since the day I married Jonah, and he started asking questions people didn't want answered." She met Creed's eyes. "At least here I'm in danger while being useful, while mattering to someone. That's better than what I had." Something shifted in Creed's expression. Not quite warmth, but an acknowledgement of understanding. They were both damaged people trying to survive in a world that didn't make space for damage. "All right then," he said quietly. "You can stay as long as you want." "Thank you." He nodded and turned toward his bedroom, but at the doorway, he paused. "Mara." "Yes?" "My daughters. They haven't smiled like that since their mother died. So whatever you're doing, whatever magic you're working, thank you." Before she could respond, he disappeared into his room, leaving Mara alone with the weight of those words. The days began to blur together in a way that was both comforting and disorienting. Mara fell into routines she hadn't realized she'd been craving. Wake before dawn, make breakfast, clean something, teach the girls something, cook dinner, read stories, sleep. Simple. Domestic. The kind of life Black Hollow had told her she didn't deserve. But here, in this isolated ranch with a grieving widower and his lonely daughters, she was building something. Not a replacement for what she'd lost. Nothing could replace Jonah, despite their marriage's complications, but maybe a different kind of family. A chosen one. The twins attached themselves to her completely. They followed her around like ducklings, helped with chores, asked endless questions about everything. Emma wanted to learn cooking. Sarah wanted to learn sewing. Both wanted stories, songs, games, attention. Mara gave them what she could, but it terrified her, because every day she felt herself caring more. Every day the thought of leaving became harder, and every day she remembered that this wasn't really hers, that she was temporary, that eventually something would happen to take this away too. 2 weeks passed, then 3. The ranch transformed under Mara's relentless work. The house became cleaner, the meals became better, the laundry got done regularly. She tackled the dead garden and somehow coaxed a few late-season vegetables back to life. She reorganized the root cellar. She patched clothing that had been torn for months. And slowly, painfully slowly, Creed began to change too. At first it was small things. He started lingering in the kitchen while she cooked, not saying much, just present. He began asking about her day. He smiled occasionally at something the girls said. The deep lines around his eyes eased fractionally. Then one evening, he actually laughed at something Emma said. A real laugh, startled out of him, and both girls froze in shock. They stared at their father like he'd just performed magic. "Papa laughed," Sarah whispered, awed. "I heard it too," Emma confirmed. Creed looked embarrassed. "I laugh." "No, you don't," both girls said in unison. "Not like that," Emma added. "Not a real laugh, not in forever." The moment was awkward and sweet and painful all at once. Creed caught Mara's eye across the table, and she saw something there she hadn't seen before. Not quite hope, but maybe the possibility of hope. After the girls went to bed that night, Creed poured himself a drink, whiskey from a bottle Mara had found while cleaning. He offered her some, and she accepted. They sat at the table in the lamplight, the house settling around them with small creaks and sighs. "I was thinking," Creed said after a long silence, "about winter." "What about it?" "It's coming fast. Maybe 6 weeks before the first real storm." He turned the glass in his hands. "Once that hits, we'll be completely cut off. No getting to town, no supplies, no help if something goes wrong, just us." Mara waited, sensing there was more. "The girls need winter clothes. So do you. You've been wearing the same dress for 3 weeks." He looked uncomfortable. "I should have thought of that sooner. We need to go to town, stock up on supplies before the pass closes." "I can't go back to Black Hollow." "I know. I'll go. You stay here with the girls." He paused. "Unless you want to come. Face them all down. Show them you're still here, still alive despite their best efforts." Mara considered that. Part of her wanted to. Wanted to walk down that main street with her head high, wanted to show Crawford and his people that they hadn't broken her. But a larger part remembered the hatred in their eyes, the cruelty in their voices, the ropes cutting into her wrists. "I'll stay here," she said quietly. Creed nodded like he'd expected that answer. "I'll need a day, maybe 2. Can you manage the ranch alone with the girls?" "We'll manage. It's more work than you think. The animals, We'll manage," Mara repeated more firmly. "I'm stronger than I look." Something flickered in Creed's eyes. "I'm starting to realize that." He left 2 days later, taking the wagon and one of the horses. The twins cried. They didn't like it when their father left, even briefly, but Mara distracted them with projects. They spent the day baking bread, mending clothes, and reorganizing the girls' small bedroom. That night, after the twins had finally fallen asleep, Mara sat alone in the main room and let herself feel the weight of isolation. The ranch felt different without Creed's presence, larger, emptier, more vulnerable. Every sound outside made her tense. Every shadow seemed threatening. She was being stupid. They were safe here. Nothing was going to happen. But her instincts, honed by 2 years of being hated, wouldn't settle. Something felt wrong, like the air before a storm, heavy with potential violence. Mara checked the locks on the doors twice, made sure the rifle Creed kept above the fireplace was loaded. Then she sat in the darkness and waited for morning, unable to shake the feeling that everything was about to change. She was right. Creed returned the next afternoon, the wagon loaded with supplies. But his face was grim, his movements tight with controlled anger. The twins ran out to greet him, but he barely responded to their chatter. Instead, he unloaded the wagon in tense silence while Mara watched from the doorway. When everything was inside and the girls were occupied with examining new fabric he'd bought, Creed pulled Mara aside. "There's talk in town," he said quietly. "Bad talk." "What kind of talk?" "Crawford's been spreading rumors, says you seduced me, says you're corrupting my daughters, Says I've lost my mind letting a cursed woman into my house. His jaw clenched. He's organizing a petition, wants to have you forcibly removed from the territory. Mara's stomach dropped. Can he do that? Legally? No, but Crawford doesn't care much about legal when he wants something. Creed glanced toward where his daughters were playing. There's more. People are talking about your husband's death, about how convenient it was that he died right before he was supposed to testify about those stolen supplies. Jonah never told me he was going to testify. Maybe he was trying to protect you. Creed's expression was hard. Or maybe he didn't trust you with the information. Either way, Crawford's scared, and scared men do stupid, dangerous things. So what do? We prepare. Winter's coming, which will make it harder for anyone to reach us. But before the pass closes, there's a window where they could try something. He moved to the window, looking out at the valley. We need to be ready. Over the next few days, Creed transformed the ranch into something resembling a fortress. He repaired weak points in the fences, moved supplies into the house, taught Mara how to properly shoot the rifle. She'd handled guns before, but never with this level of seriousness. He even showed the twins where to hide if anything bad happened, a conversation that made both girls cry, but which he insisted on having. You're scaring them, Mara told him after one particularly intense safety lesson. Better scared and alive than comfortable and dead. Is it really that bad? Would Crawford actually? I don't know. Creed's voice was flat. But I'm not taking chances. Not with my daughters. Not with you. The casual way he lumped her in with his children made something warm unfurl in Mara's chest, even as the situation itself terrified her. The first snow came early that year, a light dusting that disappeared by noon but served as a warning. Winter was coming fast. Soon, the pass would be impassable. Soon, they'd be truly isolated. Soon, they'd either be safe or trapped, depending on what Crawford decided to do. The twins seemed to sense the tension. They became clingier, more anxious, waking up from nightmares that neither could quite explain. Mara spent half her night sitting between their beds, singing soft songs until they fell back asleep. You're good with them, Creed said one night, finding her in the girls' doorway. Better than I ever was. You're good with them too. You just don't see it. I keep them alive. That's not the same as being good with them. He leaned against the doorframe, his face half in shadow. Their mother used to sing to them. I didn't even remember that until I heard you doing it. Mara didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. They stood in the quiet darkness, listening to the twins' soft breathing, and Mara wondered if this was what family was supposed to feel like. This sense of shared responsibility, shared fear, shared hope that tomorrow wouldn't destroy what you'd built today. I'm glad you stayed, Creed said finally, so quiet she almost didn't hear it. Me too. He nodded and disappeared toward his own room, leaving Mara to wonder when exactly this temporary arrangement had started feeling permanent, when she'd stopped being a refugee and started being part of something, and whether she'd survive when it inevitably got taken away. Because in her experience, everything good eventually got taken away. The storm that would change everything started building a week later. Mara could feel it in the air, that particular pressure that came before nature unleashed itself. The animals felt it too. The horses were restless. The chickens refused to leave their coop. Even Bear stayed close to the house, whining occasionally at nothing. Big one coming, Creed said, checking the sky with the practiced eye of someone who'd survived countless frontier storms. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow, but soon. How big? Big enough to close the pass for the season if we're lucky. Big enough to kill someone caught outside if we're not. He started securing everything that could blow away. Keep the girls inside. Make sure we have water stored. This could last days. Mara helped prepare, her heart beating faster with each gust of wind that rattled the windows. The twins picked up on the anxiety and stuck close to her, their small hands finding hers whenever possible. Dinner that night was quiet. Outside, the wind picked up. The sky turned that particular shade of gray-green that promised violence. The temperature dropped so fast that Mara could watch frost form on the windows. Girls' bed, Creed said after they'd eaten. Now, not in an hour. Now. For once, neither twin argued. They went quietly, both casting worried looks back at the adults. Mara helped them into their nightclothes and tucked them in, singing soft songs until their eyes closed. When she returned to the main room, Creed was loading guns. Is that necessary? She asked. Hope not. But I'd rather have them and not need them than need them and not have them. He set the rifle by the door, a pistol on the table. Storm like this, strange things happen. Animals get desperate. People get desperate. We stay alert. The first drops of rain hit the windows like bullets. Then the real storm arrived. It hit with a violence that made the house shake. Thunder crashed so loud that Mara felt it in her bones. Lightning turned the darkness into strobing daylight. The wind howled like something alive and furious, slamming against the walls hard enough that Mara genuinely worried the roof might tear off. And then came the sound that made Creed's face go white. The barn door banging open, horses screaming in terror. Damn it, Creed grabbed the rifle. Stay here with the girls. No matter what happens, you stay here. You can't go out in this. Those horses panic. They'll hurt themselves or run off, and we need them to survive winter. He was already moving toward the door. I'll be back. Then he was gone, swallowed by the storm. Mara stood frozen for exactly 3 seconds. Then she grabbed the spare coat hanging by the door and ran after him. The storm hit her like a physical blow. Rain so hard it felt like stones. Wind strong enough to nearly knock her off her feet. She could barely see 3 feet in front of her, could barely breathe against the water filling the air. But she could hear the horses, terrified, screaming. Mara ran toward the barn, her boots sliding in mud, her body battered by wind. She found Creed trying to calm a massive draft horse that was trying to kick its way through the stall. I told you to stay with the girls, he shouted over the storm. They're asleep. The horses need help. Mara grabbed the lead rope of another panicking horse, fighting to keep it from bolting. Tell me what to do. For a second, she thought he'd argue. Then another crack of thunder made both horses rear, and there was no time for anything but survival. They worked together in the chaos, calming terrified animals, securing broken gates, dragging equipment that had blown loose. Mara's hands went numb. Her clothes soaked through. Her bandaged knees, mostly healed, reopened and started bleeding again. She didn't care. She just kept moving, kept working, kept fighting against the storm that wanted to destroy everything they'd built. At some point, a young mare broke loose and bolted toward the open barn door. Mara didn't think. She just ran after it, out into the full fury of the storm. Mara, no! Creed's voice was distant, lost in the wind. But Mara was already gone, chasing a terrified horse into the darkness, into the storm, into danger that would either kill her or prove once and for all that she was strong enough to survive anything. The mare was heading straight for the ravine. Mara could barely see through the rain hammering her face, but she knew the terrain well enough by now to recognize the danger. Past the northern fence line, the ground dropped away into a steep gully that would break a horse's legs, or worse. The animal was running blind, driven by pure terror, and Mara's lungs burned as she pushed herself faster through mud that sucked at her boots with every step. Stop! She screamed, knowing it was useless. The storm swallowed her voice instantly. Lightning split the sky, and in that brief flash of white light, Mara saw the mare stumble. Not fall, but stumble hard enough to slow down. It was the only chance she'd get. Mara threw herself forward, grabbing for the trailing lead rope. Her fingers closed around wet hemp, and the sudden jerk nearly dislocated her shoulder as the horse's momentum yanked her off her feet. She hit the ground hard, mud filling her mouth, but she didn't let go. Couldn't let go. If this animal went over that edge, it would die, and Creed couldn't afford to lose livestock before winter. Easy, Mara gasped, fighting to get her feet under her, while the mare fought just as hard to keep running. Easy, girl. You're all right. You're safe. The horse didn't believe her. It pulled and twisted, wild-eyed and snorting. Mara's hands were slipping on the wet rope. Her reopened knees were screaming. The wind threatened to knock her flat again, but she held on. And slowly, so slowly, she started talking to the terrified animal. Not shouting, just talking, low and steady, the same voice she used with the twins during nightmares. Meaningless words about being safe, being okay, about how storms pass and morning always comes. The mare's ears flicked back, listening. That's it, Mara murmured, taking one careful step closer. That's my girl. Nothing's going to hurt you. I've got you. Another step. The horse snorted, but didn't bolt. Another step. Mara's hands found the mare's neck, wet and trembling with fear. She kept talking, kept moving slowly, until she could get a proper grip on the halter. Mara! She turned to find Creed fighting his way through the storm toward her, his face a mask of fury and fear. When he reached her, he grabbed her arm hard enough to bruise. "What the hell were you thinking?" he shouted over the wind. "You could have been killed. The horse would have gone over the ravine. Better the damn horse than you." His eyes were wild. "You don't run into a storm like this for an animal. You don't—" He stopped, seeming to realize he was still gripping her arm. He let go abruptly. "Take her back. I'll check the fence. You need help. I need you alive." The words came out harsh, almost angry. "The girls need you alive. So you're going back to the barn and you're staying there. Understand?" Mara wanted to argue, wanted to prove she could handle this. But the look on Creed's face stopped her. It wasn't just anger, it was genuine fear, fear that something would happen to her. "All right," she said. "All right, I'm going." She led the mare back through the storm, every step a fight against wind and rain and her own exhausted body. By the time she reached the barn, her hands were bleeding from rope burn and her legs were shaking so badly she could barely stand. The other horses had calmed down somewhat, probably exhausted by their own terror. Mara got the mare into an empty stall, checked the gates twice, then collapsed against the barn wall to catch her breath. Her whole body hurt. Not just her knees this time, but everything. Muscles she didn't know she had were screaming. Her hands were raw. Her clothes were completely soaked through, and she was starting to shiver as the adrenaline wore off and cold set in. But the horses were safe. The barn was secure. She'd done what needed doing. Creed returned maybe 20 minutes later, looking like he'd been through a war. His face was cut from flying debris, his clothes torn, but he moved through the barn checking each animal with methodical care. Only after he'd satisfied himself that everything was secure did he finally look at Mara. "You're shaking," he said. "I'm cold. You're hypothermic." He moved closer, his jaw tight. "We need to get you inside, now." "The horses are fine. Better than you." He took her arm again, gentler this time. "Can you walk?" Mara tried to stand up straight and nearly fell. Creed caught her easily, one arm around her waist, and she realized dimly that she was in worse shape than she'd thought. The cold had gotten into her bones. Her teeth were chattering so hard she couldn't speak. "All right," Creed said, and there was something different in his voice now, something almost tender. "I've got you." He half carried her back to the house through the storm. The distance that had seemed manageable before now felt endless. Mara's legs kept trying to give out, and only Creed's strength kept her upright. By the time they reached the porch, she was barely conscious. The warmth inside the house hit her like a wall. Creed kicked the door shut behind them and guided her to the chair nearest the fireplace. "Stay here," he ordered, already moving toward the bedroom. "Don't move." Mara couldn't have moved if she wanted to. She sat shivering violently while Creed returned with an armful of blankets. He wrapped them around her with surprising gentleness, then disappeared again and came back with dry clothes, one of his shirts, wool socks, everything too big but warm. "Can you change yourself?" he asked. Mara looked at her hands. They were shaking so badly she could barely grip the blanket. "I don't think so." Creed's expression flickered with something complicated. "All right, I'll help. But I'm going to close my eyes, and you're going to tell me what to do. Understood?" Under different circumstances, Mara might have laughed at the absurdity. This man had just carried her through a deadly storm, had seen her at her absolute worst, and now he was worried about propriety while she was literally dying of cold. But she was too exhausted to laugh, too cold to care. "Understood," she whispered. It was awkward and fumbling and took far too long. But eventually, Mara was in dry clothes and wrapped in multiple blankets near the fire. Creed made her drink something hot, tea or broth, she couldn't tell, and slowly, painfully, the shaking began to ease. "You're an idiot," Creed said finally, sitting across from her. He'd changed into dry clothes too, and there was a cut above his eye that needed attention. "You know that, right? Running after a horse in a storm like that? You ran after the horses first. That's different. I'm... What? Stronger? More capable?" Mara's voice was getting steadier. "I hate to break it to you, but I got that mare back safely, so maybe I'm more capable than you think." "You almost died." "But I didn't." She met his eyes. "And the horse didn't. And now we're all safe, which is what matters." Creed stared at her for a long moment, and Mara couldn't read his expression. Finally, he shook his head. "You're either the bravest person I've ever met, or the most reckless. Can it be both?" That startled a laugh out of him, actual genuine laughter that transformed his face into something younger, less burdened. Yeah, I guess it can. They sat in comfortable silence while the storm raged outside. Mara's body slowly warmed, though her hands still ached and her knees throbbed. Creed tended the fire, then finally let her clean the cut above his eye with shaking fingers. You should check on the girls, Mara said as she pressed a cloth to the wound. Already did, while you were putting on dry clothes. They slept through the whole thing. He winced as she dabbed at the cut. How they managed that with the noise, I have no idea. Children sleep through anything when they feel safe. Mara pulled the cloth away, examining her work. They feel safe here. With you. With us, Creed corrected quietly. They feel safe with us. The word hung in the air between them, us, like they were a unit, a team, something more than just a practical arrangement between strangers. Mara's hands stilled. Creed? Rowan, he interrupted. My name's Rowan, and I think after you ran into a deadly storm to save my livestock, you've earned the right to use it. Rowan, she repeated, testing the name. It felt strange on her tongue. Intimate. All right, and you need to promise me something. His gray eyes were serious. No more running into storms. No more risking your life for animals or property or anything else. Because my daughters... He stopped, took a breath. My daughters have gotten attached to you. And if something happened to you, it would destroy them. So you stay safe. For their sake. Just for their sake? The question slipped out before Mara could stop it. Rowan's expression shifted into something she couldn't quite identify. No, he said finally, not just for their sake. Before Mara could process that, before she could figure out what to say in response, a small voice came from the bedroom doorway. Papa? They both turned to find Emma standing there in her nightgown, rubbing her eyes. I heard noises. Is everything okay? Everything's fine, sweetheart, Rowan said, his voice immediately gentling. Just a storm. Nothing to worry about. Mara's all wet, Emma observed, coming closer. Her eyes widened. You're hurt. Your hands are bleeding. I'm all right, Mara assured her. Just got a little scraped up helping your papa with the horses. During the storm? Sarah appeared behind her sister, equally concerned. You went out in the storm? A horse got loose, Mara explained. We had to bring her back. Both twins looked at their father for confirmation. Rowan nodded. Mara was very brave, and very foolish, but mostly brave. Did you catch the horse? Sarah asked. I did. By yourself? By myself. The twins exchanged one of their silent twin communications. Then, simultaneously, they rushed forward and wrapped their arms around Mara, careful of her injured hands. You could have been hurt worse, Emma said, her voice muffled against Mara's shoulder. We need you, Sarah added simply, and there it was. The truth that Mara had been trying not to acknowledge. These girls needed her, genuinely needed her, not as a temporary helper or a convenient solution, but as something more permanent, something maternal. It terrified her. I'm okay, she whispered, hugging them back as carefully as her injured hands allowed. I promise. I'm okay. Rowan watched this scene with an expression that made Mara's chest tight. Then he stood up. All right, girls, back to bed. Mara needs rest, and so do you. Can we stay with her? Emma asked. Just for a little while? Please? Sarah added. Rowan looked at Mara, one eyebrow raised in question. She nodded. She couldn't speak past the lump in her throat, but she nodded. The twins settled on either side of her chair, their small, warm bodies pressed against her legs. Rowan added more wood to the fire, then settled back in his own chair. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the house there was warmth and safety and something that felt dangerously close to family. Mara closed her eyes and let herself feel it. Just for this moment. Just for tonight. Tomorrow, she'd rebuild her walls. Tomorrow, she'd remember that this was temporary, that everything eventually got taken away. But tonight, she let herself pretend this was real, that she belonged here, that these people were hers and she was theirs. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of wind that rattled the windows and rain that turned the valley into a mud pit. 3 days trapped inside the house with the twins climbing the walls from boredom, and Rowan growing increasingly tense as supplies dwindled, and the animals needed constant care. But they survived. More than survived, they thrived in that forced closeness. The girls taught Mara games their mother had played with them, games Rowan had forgotten. Rowan taught Mara how to maintain the guns properly, how to read weather patterns, how to track time without a clock by watching the light. They cooked together, cleaned together, told stories together. And slowly, in those 3 days of isolation, something fundamental shifted. Mara stopped thinking of herself as temporary. Rowan stopped watching her like she might disappear. The twins stopped asking if she was going to leave. By the time the storm finally broke and sunlight returned to the valley, they'd become something new. Not quite a family yet. That word still felt too dangerous to claim, but definitely more than strangers helping each other survive. The morning after the storm ended, Mara went outside to assess the damage. The valley was a mess. Fences down, debris everywhere. One corner of the barn roof had partially collapsed. A tree had fallen across the north path. It would take weeks to repair everything, but they were alive. The house still stood. The animals had survived. They had enough supplies to last until spring if they were careful. Could have been worse, Rowan said, coming up beside her. He'd been checking the chicken coop. Could have been a lot worse. How long until we're fully cut off? Mara asked, watching clouds gather on the peaks above them. A week, maybe 2 if we're lucky. He squinted at the pass. That storm was the warning. The real winter's coming fast now. Then we'd better get to work. They spent the next week in constant motion, repairing fences, securing buildings, stockpiling firewood, preserving what food they could. The twins helped where they could and stayed out of the way when they couldn't. Every night, they fell into bed exhausted. Every morning, they got up and did it again. On the 6th day, a rider appeared on the ridge. Mara saw him first. She was outside hanging laundry when movement caught her eye. A single horseman, sitting motionless on the ridgeline, just watching the ranch. "Rowan," she called, trying to keep her voice calm. "We have company." He emerged from the barn, saw the rider, and his whole body went tense. "Girls, inside, now!" Emma and Sarah, who'd been playing with Bear in the yard, ran for the house without argument. They'd learned to obey that tone instantly. "You think it's Crawford's people?" Mara asked quietly. "Don't know, but nobody comes out here without a reason." Rowan moved to stand beside her, his hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. "Especially not now, right before the pass closes." The rider stayed on the ridge for another minute. Then, slowly, he turned his horse and disappeared back the way he'd come. "That's not good," Mara said. "No," Rowan agreed. "That's someone scouting, checking if we're here, how many of us there are, what our defenses look like." "So Crawford's planning something." "Probably." Rowan's jaw clenched. "Question is whether he'll try it before or after we're snowed in." They increased security after that. Rowan kept a gun on him at all times. They took turns on watch at night. The twins weren't allowed outside unless both adults were present. The easy comfort of the previous weeks evaporated, replaced by constant vigilance. 3 days later, the rider returned, this time with 2 others. They didn't come close to the ranch, just sat on the ridge again, watching, making their presence known, sending a message. "We know where you are, and we're coming." "They're trying to scare us," Mara said, watching them through the kitchen window. "It's working." Rowan was loading guns at the table. "They're waiting for something, maybe reinforcements, maybe just the right moment." "What do we do?" "We prepare, and we hope winter gets here first." That night, Mara couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed listening to the house settle and the wind beginning to pick up again. Another storm was building. She could feel it. She got up finally and moved to the main room, thinking she'd make tea. Instead, she found Rowan sitting in the darkness by the window, rifle across his knees, staring out at the night. "Can't sleep either?" she asked quietly. "Sleep's a luxury right now." He didn't look away from the window. "Someone needs to watch." "You can't watch every night. You'll collapse." "I'll manage." "Rowan?" "I can't let anything happen to you." The words came out harsh, almost angry. "Or the girls. I can't—" He stopped, took a breath. "I already lost one woman I cared about. I can't— I won't lose another." Mara's heart stuttered in her chest. "What?" Rowan finally turned to look at her, and his expression was raw. "You really don't know? You really haven't figured it out?" Figured what out? That I. He stood up abruptly, setting the rifle aside. That these past weeks have been. That you've become. He seemed to be struggling with words. My daughters love you, and I'm not far behind them. The silence that followed was deafening. You don't mean that, Mara said finally, her voice barely a whisper. You're grateful I've helped with the girls. I'm falling in love with you. The blunt honesty of it struck her like a physical blow. And that terrifies me because I don't know if I can survive losing someone again. But it's true. And you should know. Mara's mind was racing. This was impossible. This wasn't how things worked. Men like Rowan didn't fall in love with women like her. Women who'd been publicly humiliated. Women who'd been called cursed and barren and worthless. Women with bodies that didn't fit the mold of what was considered acceptable. Say something, Rowan said quietly. I don't know what to say. The truth would be a start. The truth. What was the truth? That she'd been falling too these past weeks? That she'd started looking forward to his presence, to his rare smiles, to the way he listened when she talked? That she'd begun to imagine a future here, with him and his daughters, something permanent and real? I'm scared, she admitted finally. I'm scared of wanting this. I'm scared of losing it. I'm scared that Crawford, or the town, or just life will take it away like everything else gets taken away. I'm scared too, Rowan said, but I'm more scared of not trying, of letting fear stop me from having something good just because I might lose it later. He moved closer, and Mara could see the sincerity in his eyes, the vulnerability. This hard man who'd survived war and grief and frontier life was opening himself up to her completely. If you don't feel the same, he started. I do, Mara interrupted. I do feel the same. That's what scares me. Then be scared with me. His hand found hers, careful of her healing injuries. We'll be scared together, but we'll also be together. And that has to count for something. Mara looked at their joined hands. Hers were larger than most women's, scarred from work and recent wounds. His were rough and calloused from a lifetime of labor. Neither of them were perfect. Neither of them were what society said they should be. But maybe that was the point. Maybe perfection was overrated. Maybe what mattered was finding someone who saw your scars and stayed anyway. All right, she said softly. All right, let's try. Rowan's smile was like sunrise, slow, warm, transforming. He squeezed her hand gently. You won't regret this. Don't make promises you can't keep, Mara replied, but she was smiling too. They stayed there in the darkness, hands joined, watching the window for threats that might or might not come. And for the first time since Jonah died, Mara allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she could have this, could deserve this. The next morning, the twins figured it out immediately. You're holding hands, Emma squealed, pointing at where Mara and Rowan were working together to repair a section of fence. We are not, Rowan said, but he was. You are too, Sarah bounced excitedly. Does this mean Mara's staying forever? We haven't discussed forever, Mara said quickly. But you're staying? Emma's eyes were huge and hopeful. You're really staying? Mara looked at Rowan. He looked back at her, one eyebrow raised in question. She took a breath. I'm staying, she said. The twins erupted in cheers. They ran to Mara and nearly knocked her over with the force of their hug. Bear started barking, caught up in the excitement. And Rowan stood there watching his daughters embrace the woman who'd saved them all, and something in his expression made Mara's eyes sting with tears she refused to shed. This was real. This was happening. She had a family again. The riders returned that afternoon. This time there were 5 of them, and they didn't stay on the ridge. They rode down into the valley, stopping maybe 100 yards from the house, close enough to be threatening, close enough to make a statement. Rowan grabbed his rifle. Get the girls inside, now! Mara herded the twins into the house and positioned them in their designated hiding spot, the root cellar, accessible through a trapdoor in the kitchen. Stay here, she ordered. No matter what you hear, you stay here until your father or I come get you. Understand? Both girls nodded, their faces pale with fear. Mara returned to the main room to find Rowan at the door, rifle ready. She picked up the other gun, the one he'd taught her to use, and took up position by the window. If they come closer, Rowan started. I know what to do. The riders sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then one of them, a man Mara recognized as Deputy Harris, called out, "Creed, we need to talk." Rowan opened the door but stayed behind it, using it as cover. "So talk." "Crawford wants the woman. Send her out and we'll leave peaceful." "Not happening. Don't be stupid, Creed. She's not worth dying for. That's not your decision to make." Harris was quiet for a moment. Then, "We can do this easy or hard. Your choice." "Here's my choice," Rowan raised his voice. "You and your boys turn around and ride back to Black Hollow. Tell Crawford that Mara Vale is under my protection. Tell him if he wants her, he'll have to come through me." "That can be arranged." "I'm sure it can. But I'm also sure Crawford doesn't want to explain to the territorial marshal why 5 of his men died trying to kidnap a woman from private property." Rowan's voice went cold. "Because that's what this is, kidnapping, and murder if you try it." The riders shifted uneasily. Clearly they hadn't expected this level of resistance. Harris leaned over to confer with the others. Mara couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language suggested disagreement. Finally, Harris turned back. "This isn't over, Creed. I know. Crawford's not going to let this go. Tell him to try me when spring comes. By then, maybe he'll have the guts to show his face himself instead of sending lackeys." That struck a nerve. Even from this distance, Mara could see Harris's face redden, but he didn't argue. Instead, he wheeled his horse around and led the others back up toward the ridge. Rowan didn't lower his rifle until they disappeared completely. Then he closed the door and slumped against it, the tension draining out of him all at once. "That was close," Mara said quietly. "Too close." He set the rifle aside. "But it bought us time. Maybe enough time for winter to close the pass. And if it doesn't, then we fight." He looked at her. "Can you do that? If it comes to it?" Mara thought about everything she'd survived. The humiliation, the isolation, the death of her husband, the town's hatred, the storm. All of it. "Yes," she said. "I can fight." Rowan nodded, something like pride in his expression. Then he went to get his daughters from the cellar, holding both of them while they cried from fear and relief. That night, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. The next morning, it started snowing. Not the light dusting from before, but heavy, serious snow that fell steadily for hours. By evening, 6 inches covered the ground. By the next morning, it was a foot and still coming down. Winter had arrived, and with it, their salvation. The pass closed 3 days later, completely impassable until spring thaw. They were cut off from Black Hollow, from Crawford, from the world. They were safe, but they were also alone. Truly alone. Just the 4 of them, and whatever they could survive on until the snow melted and the world returned. "We made it," Mara said, watching the snow fall past the window. "We made it," Rowan agreed. Then, quietly, "But we've got 4 months ahead of us. A lot can happen in 4 months." Mara turned to look at him. "Like what?" "Like deciding if this," he gestured between them, "is real, or just convenience born of crisis." "It's real," Mara said firmly. "At least for me. Is it real for you?" Rowan pulled her close, his arms warm and solid around her. "Yes, it's real." Outside, the snow continued to fall, burying roads and hiding trails. Inside, a family that hadn't existed 2 months ago held each other and hoped they were strong enough to survive whatever came next. Winter settled over the valley like a blanket made of silence and ice. The snow that had saved them from Crawford's men now became their entire world, a white expanse that stretched in every direction, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. The ranch transformed into an island, cut off completely from everything beyond the mountain pass. For the first week, Mara kept expecting something terrible to happen, some disaster that would prove this fragile peace couldn't last. But days passed, then another week, and slowly she began to understand that they were truly safe, at least for now. The isolation forced intimacy. There was nowhere to hide, no escape from each other's presence. They ate every meal together, worked side by side on daily chores, shared the same limited space every evening. It should have been suffocating. Instead, it felt like exhaling after holding her breath for years. The twins flourished in ways Mara hadn't expected. Without the shadow of town judgment hanging over them, they became louder, sillier, more themselves. Emma revealed a wicked sense of humor that had Rowan laughing more than Mara had thought possible. Sarah showed an unexpected talent for drawing, filling scraps of paper with surprisingly detailed sketches of the ranch, the animals, her family. Her family. That's what they'd become. Mara caught herself thinking it more and more, even as part of her still waited for the other shoe to drop. One evening, about 3 weeks into their isolation, after the girls had gone to bed, Rowan produced a battered fiddle from somewhere in the back of a closet. "I didn't know you played," Mara said, watching him tune it with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this thousands of times. "Haven't in years, not since—" He didn't finish, but she understood. Not since his wife died. "Found it today while looking for extra blankets. Figured maybe it was time." He played badly at first, his fingers clumsy from lack of practice. But slowly the music found its rhythm, and Mara recognized the tune, something her own mother used to hum while cooking. Without thinking, she started singing the words, her voice rough from disuse but carrying the melody well enough. Rowan's hand stilled on the fiddle. He stared at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What?" Mara asked, suddenly self-conscious. "Nothing. Just, that was my wife's favorite song. I haven't heard anyone sing it since she died." His voice was thick with emotion. "You have a beautiful voice." "I have a passable voice that's very out of practice." "Beautiful," he insisted. "Sing something else." So she did. And he played. And for the first time, Mara felt the ghost of his dead wife settle into something less painful. Not forgotten, but no longer a wound that wouldn't heal. She was becoming part of the family's story rather than replacing anyone in it. The moment felt significant in a way Mara couldn't quite articulate, like they'd crossed some invisible threshold into something more permanent. Later that night, as Mara was banking the fire for sleep, Rowan spoke from where he sat mending a harness. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "about spring." Mara's stomach clenched. Here it was, the conversation about what would happen when the pass opened and the real world returned. What about it? "Crawford's not going to let this go. When the snow melts, he'll come. Maybe not immediately, but eventually." Rowan set down his work. "We need a plan." "What kind of plan?" "The kind that ends this permanently." He looked at her directly. "I think we should go to the territorial marshal, present everything we know about the stolen supplies, about Jonah's death, about Crawford's corruption. Make it official." "You think they'll believe us?" "The town will back Crawford. They always have." "Not everyone." Rowan leaned forward. "There were people in that crowd the day they dragged you through the streets who looked uncomfortable. People who didn't join in the shouting. Maybe not many, but some. And there have to be others who've suffered under Crawford's control. People who'd speak up if they thought someone would actually listen." Mara wanted to believe him, but she'd lived in Black Hollow too long to trust in people's better nature. "Even if you're right, going to the marshal means leaving the ranch, taking the girls back toward danger." "I know, but staying here and waiting for Crawford to make his move means living in fear forever." His jaw tightened. "I won't raise my daughters that way, and I won't let you live that way either." "So what are you suggesting?" "When spring comes, we don't wait. We strike first. We ride straight to the territorial capital, present our case, and force the law to deal with Crawford before he can come after us." Rowan's eyes were fierce. "We end this, properly." It was a bold plan, maybe too bold, but Mara found herself nodding. "All right, but we need evidence, actual proof, not just accusations." "Agreed, which means we spend the winter preparing, writing down everything we remember, every suspicious detail, every conversation that didn't quite add up." He paused. "Did Jonah leave any papers? Anything that might document what he found?" Mara thought back to the weeks after Jonah's death. She'd been so consumed by grief and survival that she hadn't thoroughly searched their cabin. "I don't know. Crawford claimed the property so fast I barely had time to collect my own clothes before they locked me out." "Then we'll have to work with what we remember." Rowan pulled out paper and a pencil. "Start from the beginning. Tell me everything." So Mara did. She talked about Jonah's growing suspicion in the months before he died, how he'd started asking questions about supply shipments that never arrived, about families who went hungry despite supposedly abundant deliveries from the territorial government, how he'd confided in her that something wasn't right, that someone was stealing from people who had nothing. "He was going to talk to the marshal," Mara said quietly. He told me the night before he died, said he had enough evidence to prove Crawford and the council were diverting supplies for their own profit. She wrapped her arms around herself. The next day he went to check the fence line and never came back. You think they killed him? I think the timing was awfully convenient. Mara's voice was bitter. A sudden storm. Jonah getting lost despite knowing that land like his own hand. And then Crawford showing up at the funeral with papers claiming Jonah owed massive debts. Debts I'd never heard of, that Jonah never mentioned. She looked up at Rowan. I think they murdered my husband and then stole everything he owned to cover their tracks. The silence that followed was heavy. Finally, Rowan said, We'll prove it. Somehow, we'll prove it. They worked late into the night, documenting everything they could remember. Names, dates, suspicious incidents. By the time they finally stopped, they had several pages of notes. Not proof exactly, but a starting point. Over the following weeks, they added to it whenever they remembered something new. The twins noticed the adults spending time bent over papers, but didn't ask too many questions. They were used to their father working on ranch accounts and seemed to accept that Mara was helping him. Meanwhile, life in their isolated bubble continued. They celebrated the winter solstice with a small feast Mara managed to cobble together from stored supplies. The twins made decorations from pine branches and scraps of fabric. Rowan carved small wooden animals for each girl, a horse for Emma, a dog for Sarah, that they treasured like diamonds. On the longest night, they sat around the fire and Rowan told stories from his days as a military scout. The girls listened with wide eyes while Mara tried not to think too hard about all the danger he'd survived, all the ways he could have died before she ever met him. You're thinking too loud, Rowan murmured later after the twins had fallen asleep and they sat together by the dying fire. I'm thinking about how fragile this all is, Mara admitted. How easily it could all fall apart. Everything's fragile. Doesn't mean it's not worth having. He took her hand, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on her palm. You're worth having. This family is worth having, even if it scares me. It terrifies me, Mara said honestly. Good. That means it matters. Rowan pulled her closer. My wife used to say that if something doesn't scare you at least a little, you're not investing enough of yourself in it. She was scared when she married me, scared when we had the girls, scared every day of frontier life. But she said the fear meant she was alive. It was the first time Rowan had really talked about his wife as a person rather than just a loss. Mara held very still, not wanting to break the moment. Her name was Catherine, he continued, and she would have liked you. She always said I needed someone who wouldn't put up with my bullshit. He smiled slightly. You don't put up with my bullshit. No, Mara agreed. I don't. Catherine would appreciate that. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to embers. Outside, wind howled through the valley, but inside they were warm and safe and together. For now, that was enough. January arrived with temperatures so cold that water froze solid within minutes of being drawn from the well. The twins couldn't go outside for more than a few minutes without risking frostbite. Even the animals huddled miserably in the barn, conserving heat. Cabin fever set in hard. The girls got restless and quarrelsome, fighting over toys and space and attention. Rowan grew short-tempered from the stress of keeping everyone safe in such brutal conditions. Even Mara felt the walls closing in, felt her patience wearing thin. One particularly bad day, Emma and Sarah got into a screaming fight over something trivial. Who got to sit in the good chair, maybe? Or who'd eaten the last dried apple? Their shouts escalated until Sarah shoved Emma, who shoved back harder, and suddenly both girls were crying while Rowan bellowed at them to stop. Enough! His voice was sharp enough to make everyone freeze. Both of you separate corners, now! The twins obeyed, still sniffling, while Rowan ran his hands through his hair in frustration. Mara could see the tension in every line of his body, the way his jaw clenched as he struggled to control his temper. I'll handle this, she said quietly. They need to learn, I know. And they will. But right now, everyone needs a minute to breathe. She touched his arm gently, including you. Rowan looked like he wanted to argue, but finally he nodded and retreated to the bedroom, closing the door harder than necessary. Mara turned to the twins, who were both watching her with red, swollen eyes. All right, she said, sitting down between them. Here's what's going to happen. You're both going to tell me what's really wrong. And I don't mean the chair or the apple or whatever you were fighting about. I mean what's really bothering you. Emma was the first to crack. "I'm sick of being inside," she burst out. "I'm sick of the cold and the same food and the same games and never going anywhere or doing anything new. I want to go outside. I want to see something different. I want—" Her voice broke. "I want my mama." Sarah started crying again, harder this time. "Me too. I know Mara's nice and I like her, but I want mama. And I know that makes Papa sad, but I can't help it. I just want her back." Mara's heart cracked open. These poor girls, trapped in a cabin with winter pressing in and grief still raw despite 4 years passing. Of course they were struggling. Of course they were lashing out. "Come here," she said, opening her arms. Both twins crawled into her lap, too big for this really, but needing it desperately. "It's okay to miss your mama. It's okay to be sad about it. And it's okay to love me while still loving her. Those things don't cancel each other out." "Papa gets upset when we talk about her," Sarah whispered. "That's because he misses her too, and it hurts. But that doesn't mean you can't talk about her. Tell me about her. What was she like?" So they did. Through tears and hiccups, the twins told Mara about their mother, how she sang while cooking, how she told elaborate bedtime stories, how she could fix anything that broke, how she smelled like lavender and bread, how she died calling their names, wanting to see her babies one more time. Mara held them and listened and let her own tears fall silently. For Catherine, who'd died too young. For these girls who'd lost so much. For Rowan, who'd loved his wife and now was trying to love again despite the terror of it. When the tears finally stopped, Emma looked up at Mara with swollen eyes. "Do you think Mama would like you?" "I hope so," Mara said honestly. "But what matters more is whether you like me. Do you?" Both girls nodded emphatically. "We love you," Sarah said, "even when we're mean and fighty and awful." "You're not awful. You're just human. And humans are messy and complicated, and sometimes we hurt the people we love even when we don't mean to." Mara smoothed their hair back. "But that's okay. We forgive each other and we try to do better. That's what family does." "Are we a family?" Emma asked. "Really, truly?" "Really, truly," Mara confirmed. The door to the bedroom opened and Rowan emerged, looking sheepish. "I'm sorry," he said, "for yelling. I was frustrated with the winter and worried about supplies, and I took it out on you girls. That wasn't fair." Both twins scrambled off Mara's lap and ran to their father, who caught them in a fierce hug. "I love you both," he said roughly. "So much. And I'm sorry I get upset when you talk about your mama. You should talk about her. You should remember her. She'd want that." "Mara said we can love both of you," Sarah said. "Mara's right." Rowan looked at Mara over his daughters' heads, and the gratitude in his expression made her throat tight. "She's usually right, which is annoying but useful." That got a small laugh from the girls. The tension in the cabin eased. They spent the rest of the day playing quiet games and telling stories about Catherine. Not sad stories, but funny ones. Good memories that deserved to be shared. That night, after the twins were asleep, Rowan found Mara in the kitchen. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for handling that better than I did. You were doing fine. You just needed a minute. I needed a partner who knows how to actually deal with emotions instead of burying them under work and anger." He moved closer. "I needed you." Mara turned to face him. "I need you too. And the girls. I need all of this." She took a breath, which is why it terrifies me so much. Because I've never had anything I was this afraid to lose. "Then we'll just have to make sure we don't lose it." Rowan cupped her face in his rough hands. "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before answering." "All right. When spring comes, after we deal with Crawford, after we clear your name and make sure you're safe, will you marry me? Officially, legally, in front of whatever remains of Black Hollow or the whole territorial government or whoever needs to witness it. Will you be my wife and the girl's mother for real?" Mara's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it. "You're asking me now? In the middle of winter with Crawford still out there and everything uncertain? I'm asking now because I don't want to wait. I've wasted 4 years being too scared to live. I'm done wasting time." His gray eyes were intense. "So yes or no, Mara Vale, will you marry me?" She should say no. Should wait until things were settled, until the danger passed, until she could be sure this wasn't just desperation born of isolation. But she was tired of being practical, tired of protecting herself, tired of waiting for permission to want things. "Yes," she said. Yes, I'll marry you. Rowan's smile was like dawn breaking. He kissed her then, their first real kiss, not just a brief touch of lips, but something deep and meaningful and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, they were both shaking. Spring can't come fast enough, Rowan murmured. Spring means danger, Mara reminded him. Spring means ending this, and then the rest of our lives. He pulled her close. I'll take that deal. February brought a slight warming, enough that the twins could play outside for short periods. They built snow forts and had snowball fights, and helped Rowan dig paths between the house and barn. Their laughter echoed across the frozen valley, bright and alive. Mara watched them from the window one afternoon, feeling a contentment she'd never quite experienced before. This was her family now. These people were hers, and she was going to fight like hell to keep them. What are you thinking? Rowan asked, coming up behind her. That I want to kill Crawford for making us wait until spring to deal with him. Rowan laughed. Patience. We'll get our chance. I'm not a patient person. I've noticed. He wrapped his arms around her waist. But you're good at everything else, so I'll forgive that one flaw. Just one flaw? I have a whole list. So do I. We'll compare notes later. They stood together, watching the girls play, and Mara let herself believe that maybe this could last. Maybe she could have this. The first real thaw came in mid-March. The ice on the creek broke with sounds like gunshots. Snow began melting faster than the ground could absorb it, turning everything to mud. The pass was still blocked, would be for at least another month, but the change was coming. With it came tension. Everyone knew that once they could leave the valley, they'd have to face what was waiting in Black Hollow. Have to finish what had started the day Rowan cut Mara's ropes and claimed her under his protection. One evening, Rowan pulled out their accumulated notes and evidence. We need more, he said flatly. This isn't enough to convince a marshal. It's all circumstantial, all hearsay. Then what do we do? We need someone from Black Hollow to testify. Someone who saw something concrete. Someone Crawford can't intimidate or buy off. He frowned. Problem is, who would be willing to do that? Mara thought about the people she'd known in town. Most had turned on her completely. But there had been a few, very few, who'd looked uncomfortable during her humiliation. A young widow named Helen, whose husband had also died suspiciously. A stable worker named Tom who'd whispered an apology when he thought no one was listening. A merchant's daughter who'd left food on Mara's doorstep anonymously during the worst times. There might be a few, she said slowly, people who've suffered under Crawford's control but were too scared to speak up. If we could reach them privately, convince them to come forward together. That's risky. Any one of them could warn Crawford. Everything about this is risky. Mara met his eyes. But if we want to end this properly, we need to take that risk. They spent the next few weeks refining their plan. When the pass opened, they'd ride to Black Hollow, all four of them, because leaving the girls at the ranch alone wasn't an option. They'd quietly contact the people Mara thought might be sympathetic. If they could gather enough testimonies, they'd take everything to the territorial marshal and force a formal investigation. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. The twins sensed the coming confrontation. They grew clingy again, not wanting to let Mara or Rowan out of their sight. Emma had nightmares about bad men coming to take Mara away. Sarah stopped eating properly, her stomach too nervous to handle food. We're scaring them, Mara said one night after both girls had finally cried themselves to sleep. I know, but I don't know how to make this easier for them. Rowan looked exhausted. They've already lost one parent. The thought of losing another, they won't. We won't let that happen. You can't promise that. Watch me. Mara's voice was fierce. I survived Black Hollow's hatred. I survived being dragged through the streets. I survived that storm and Crawford's threats and a winter that could have killed us all. I can survive whatever comes next, and so can you, and so can they. Rowan studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled slightly. You know what terrifies me most? It's not Crawford or his men or even the possibility of dying. It's how much I believe you when you say that. Then believe me. And let's finish this. The pass opened on a warm day in mid-April. The snow had finally melted enough to make the road passable, though it would be muddy and treacherous. Rowan spent 2 days preparing for the journey, checking the wagon, making sure the horses were sound, packing supplies they might need. The night before they were set to leave, Mara couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around her. Tomorrow, they'd ride back toward Black Hollow. Tomorrow, they'd either end Crawford's reign or die trying. She heard soft footsteps, and then Rowan was in her doorway. "You're awake." "Couldn't sleep." "Me neither." He hesitated. "Can I—" Mara scooted over to make room. Rowan climbed into the narrow bed and they lay side by side in the darkness. It was completely innocent, but also deeply intimate. Just being close, sharing space, existing together. "I'm scared," Mara admitted quietly. "Me too. But I'm also angry. Crawford took my husband, took my home, took my dignity, and I want him to pay for that." "He will." Rowan's hand found hers. "One way or another, he will." They lay there until dawn, not sleeping, just being together. And when the sun finally rose, they got up and prepared to face whatever came next. The twins were unusually quiet during breakfast. They ate mechanically, their eyes darting between the adults, clearly picking up on the tension. "Girls," Rowan said finally, "you understand where we're going today?" Both nodded. "To stop the bad man," Emma said. "To make it safe again," Sarah added. "That's right. And I need you both to be very brave. Can you do that?" "We're always brave," Emma said, but her voice shook. "We're Creeds," Sarah added. "Creeds don't cry." But her eyes were already filling with tears. Mara knelt in front of them. "Creeds are allowed to cry. Everyone's allowed to cry. But you're also allowed to be brave. And you know what? You can be both at the same time. That's what being human means." She hugged them both fiercely, breathing in their little girl smell, memorizing the feel of their arms around her neck. If anything happened today, if Crawford won, at least she'd had this. At least she'd known what it felt like to be loved by children who chose her. They loaded into the wagon as the sun climbed higher. Rowan drove, rifle within easy reach. Mara sat beside him with another gun across her lap. The twins huddled in the back with Bear, who seemed to understand the gravity of the situation and stayed close to them. The ride to Black Hollow took most of the day. The roads were terrible, muddy, and rutted from winter damage. They had to stop twice to clear fallen branches. But slowly, inevitably, they got closer to town. "You sure about this?" Rowan asked as the buildings came into view. "No," Mara said honestly, "but we're doing it anyway." They rode into Black Hollow at sunset, when long shadows stretched across the street, and the town was settling in for evening. People stopped to stare as the wagon passed. Mara kept her head high, refusing to look away, refusing to show fear. The whispers started immediately. She could hear them even over the sound of the wagon wheels. "That's her." "The cursed widow. Can't believe she dared come back." "Where's Crawford? Someone get Crawford." But Rowan didn't stop. He drove straight through town to the marshal's office, a small building on the far end of the main street. They climbed down from the wagon, and Rowan reached back to help the twins. "Stay close," he ordered them, "right beside Mara or me. Don't wander off." The marshal's office was lit from inside. Through the window, Mara could see a man bent over paperwork. Rowan pushed open the door without knocking. The marshal looked up, clearly startled. He was older than Mara expected, maybe 60, with gray hair and a weathered face. His eyes went wide when he saw who'd entered his office. "Rowan Creed," the marshal said slowly. "Heard you'd taken in Mara Vale, caused quite a stir." "I bet it did," Rowan said. "Marshal Garrett, we need to talk. About corruption in Black Hollow. About murder. About stolen supplies and abuse of power." He pulled out their carefully documented notes. "And we have evidence." Marshal Garrett's expression shifted from surprise to something more interested. "That's a serious accusation." "It's a serious crime," Mara said, finding her voice. "And it's been going on for years." The marshal studied her for a long moment. Then he gestured to the chairs in front of his desk. "All right, I'm listening. Start from the beginning." So they did. They told him everything. About Jonah's suspicions and his death, about the missing supplies and starving families, about Crawford's corruption and the town council's complicity, about the humiliation and the threats and the attempts to drive Mara out of the territory. Marshal Garrett listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each detail. When they finally finished, he sat back in his chair and let out a long breath. "That's quite a story," he said. It's the truth, Rowan said firmly. I believe you. Problem is, believing you and proving it are two different things. The marshal tapped the papers they'd given him. This is good documentation, but it's all secondhand. I need witnesses, people who'll testify under oath about what they saw. We have names, Mara said. People who might be willing to talk if they knew they'd be protected. Might be isn't good enough. I need definite. I need people willing to stand up in front of the whole town and tell the truth, knowing Crawford will come after them for it. Outside, Mara could hear voices gathering. News of their arrival was spreading fast. Soon Crawford would know they were here. Soon, this would come to a head one way or another. Give us until tomorrow, Rowan said. Let us talk to people. We'll get you witnesses. Marshal Garrett looked skeptical. Crawford's probably already on his way here. You might not have until tomorrow. Then we'll work fast. Rowan stood up. But we're not leaving until this is finished, one way or another. The marshal nodded slowly. All right, but Creed, you've got a target on your back now. You and Mrs. Vale both. Watch yourselves. They left the office to find a crowd gathering in the street. Not a mob exactly, but close to it. Curious faces, hostile faces. A few that looked almost sympathetic but were too afraid to show it openly. And there, pushing through the crowd, was Thomas Crawford. He'd aged in the months since Mara had last seen him. His face was harder, meaner, carved by anger and fear into something ugly. When his eyes landed on Mara, pure hatred flashed across his features. Well, well, Crawford said, his voice carrying across the street. The cursed widow returns. Thought we'd seen the last of you, Mara. Disappointed? Mara kept her voice steady. Disgusted. Crawford's gaze shifted to Rowan. And you, Creed, thought you were smarter than to tie yourself to garbage like her. The twins pressed against Mara's sides. She put her hands on their shoulders, keeping them close. Careful, Crawford, Rowan said, his voice dangerously quiet. Those are words you might regret. Is that a threat? It's a fact. Rowan's hand rested casually near his gun. We've been to see the marshal, told him everything about your operation, the stolen supplies, the fraud, the murder. Crawford's face went pale, then red. That's slander. You have no proof. We have plenty of proof. And by tomorrow, we'll have witnesses too. Rowan stepped forward. Your time is done, Crawford. Whether you accept it now or after the marshal arrests you, that's your choice. But it's done. For a moment, Crawford looked like he might actually go for his weapon. His hand twitched toward his belt, and Mara's heart stopped. But then Marshal Garrett emerged from his office, his own gun clearly visible, and Crawford froze. No trouble in my town, the marshal said quietly. Everyone goes home. Now. The crowd began to disperse reluctantly. Crawford stared at Mara for another long moment, his eyes promising violence. Then he turned and walked away, but his rigid posture suggested this was far from over. You folks need a place to stay tonight? The marshal asked. We'll manage, Rowan said. Then manage somewhere safe. Crawford's not going to let this lie. They returned to the wagon and headed toward the edge of town, looking for somewhere secure to spend the night. As they drove, Mara noticed people watching from windows, heard whispers following them. But she also noticed something else. A few people, not many, but a few, were looking at them differently. Not with hatred, but with something that might have been hope. Tomorrow, they'd find out if hope was enough. Tomorrow, they'd either win or lose everything. Tonight, they held each other close and prepared for war. They spent the night in the old livery stable at the edge of town. The owner was a quiet man named Dutch, who'd lost his son to the same brutal winter that killed Jonah. He didn't ask questions, just pointed them to a clean corner with fresh hay and brought blankets without being asked. Heard what you're doing, Dutch said gruffly as he set down the blankets. About time someone stood up to Crawford. He paused at the door. My boy didn't freeze to death. He starved because the supplies never came, just thought you should know that. After he left, Rowan built a small fire in the stable's old forge, while Mara settled the twins in their makeshift beds. The girls were exhausted, but too keyed up to sleep, their eyes darting nervously at every sound from outside. Tell us a story, Emma whispered. Please, something good. So Mara told them about a girl who lived in a castle made of ice, who everyone said was cursed, but who turned out to be the bravest person in the kingdom. She made up details as she went, but the message was clear. Sometimes the people everyone fears are actually the ones who save everyone else. When both girls finally drifted off, Mara joined Rowan by the fire. He was cleaning his rifle for the third time, his movements mechanical and anxious. "We're going to have to move fast tomorrow," he said quietly. "Crawford won't wait for us to build a case against him." "Then we need to be ready." Mara watched the firelight play across his weathered face. "Helen Morrison, if we can get her to talk about her husband's death, that's 2 suspicious deaths with the same pattern. She's terrified of Crawford." "Then we offer her protection, the marshal's protection." Mara's voice was firm. "We can't do this halfway." They sat together in the quiet darkness, listening to the twins breathe and the horses shuffle in their stalls. Outside, Black Hollow slept uneasily, waiting for the storm everyone knew was coming. Dawn came gray and cold. They ate a quick breakfast, then prepared to face the town. The twins stayed close, their small hands gripping Mara's skirt with white-knuckled intensity. Helen Morrison lived in a small house on the north side of town. Mara knocked while Rowan stood guard. The door opened a crack, and Helen's frightened face appeared. "Mara, what are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you, about James, about how he really died." Helen's face went even paler. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do. The same thing that happened to my Jonah happened to your James." Mara kept her voice low and urgent. "Please, Helen, help me stop Crawford before he hurts anyone else." For a long moment, Helen just stared. Then her eyes filled with tears. "They'll kill me if I talk. They'll kill someone else if you don't." Mara touched her arm gently. "How many more husbands have to die?" Helen's breath hitched. James found records, ledgers showing where the supplies really went. He was going to expose it all. She wiped at her eyes roughly. 3 days later, he was dead, and Crawford came to the funeral with papers showing James supposedly owed money. He took everything. "Will you testify to that, in front of the marshal?" Helen looked past Mara to where Rowan stood with the twins. "Those your girls?" "They are. You're doing this for them." "I'm doing it for everyone." Mara squeezed Helen's hand. "But yes, mostly for them." Helen was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. "All right, I'll talk." They collected 2 more testimonies that morning. Tom, the stable worker, who'd been paid to falsify records, and Martha Hendricks, the same woman who'd shouted insults during Mara's humiliation, who broke down crying and admitted her husband had been threatened into supporting Crawford's schemes. "I'm sorry," Martha sobbed. "I'm so sorry for what I said to you that day." Mara wanted to be angry, but looking at Martha's genuine remorse, she found she couldn't. "Help me now," Mara said simply. "That's how you make it right." By noon, they had 5 people willing to testify. They gathered at the marshal's office, a nervous group who'd finally found courage. Marshal Garrett listened to each testimony with increasing grimness. When the last person finished, he nodded slowly. "This is enough, more than enough to arrest Crawford and the entire council." Within an hour, Marshal Garrett had assembled 20 men, farmers and workers who'd suffered under Crawford's rule and were done suffering in silence. They armed themselves and prepared to march on the council building. "You should stay here," Rowan told Mara, "with the girls." "No." Mara's voice was firm. "I started this. I'm finishing it." They left the twins in the marshal's office with strict instructions to stay inside. The group marched through the center of town in the early afternoon. People lined the streets to watch, some pleased, others angry, most just shocked. They found Crawford at his grain storage building. He looked up when Marshal Garrett entered with 20 armed men, and his face went through surprise, anger, and finally fear. "Thomas Crawford," Marshal Garrett said formally. "You're under arrest for fraud, theft of government supplies, and conspiracy to commit murder." Crawford stood slowly. "You have no proof." "I have 5 witnesses who say otherwise." The marshal gestured to his deputies. "You can come peacefully, or we can do this the hard way." For a moment, Crawford's hand moved toward his weapon. Several deputies raised their guns. The tension was suffocating. Then Crawford's shoulders slumped. "It was supposed to be temporary," he said quietly. "Just skim a little off the top. But then winter came hard, and people started dying, and it was easier to keep taking than to stop." He looked at Mara. "Your husband, I didn't want that, but he wouldn't stay quiet." "So you killed him," Mara said flatly. "I had him killed," as if that distinction mattered. "And now it's all over anyway. You didn't build anything. Mara said coldly. You stole from people who had nothing. You murdered good men. You don't get to paint yourself as tragic. Crawford flinched but didn't argue. Marshal Garrett's deputies took him into custody. As they were led away, Crawford turned back one last time. For what it's worth, I am sorry. No, Mara said. It doesn't change anything. They returned to the marshal's office to find the twins pressed against the window. When they saw Mara and Rowan, both girls burst into tears of relief. Mara gathered them close. It's over, she told them. It's really over. The next few days were chaos. Crawford's arrest triggered confessions from other council members. Marshal Garrett brought in territorial authorities. The stolen supplies were tracked down and restitution promised. And the truth about Jonah's death emerged. He'd been lured into the storm by a man paid by Crawford, left to die in the cold. The signed confession was found among Crawford's records. Mara read that confession alone. The clinical details of her husband's murder, how he'd begged, how he'd asked them to tell Mara he loved her, how they'd walked away. She cried then, finally cried for Jonah properly. Real gutting sorrow for a good man who'd tried to do right and died for it. Rowan found her there and held her while she broke apart and slowly pieced herself back together. That night, the town held an emergency meeting, not to judge Mara, but to hear the full extent of Crawford's crimes. People who'd participated in her humiliation sat in stunned silence. When the marshal finished, Helen Morrison stood up. I want to apologize to Mara Vale for my silence, for not standing up when I should have, for being a coward. One by one, others stood. Martha apologized for the insults. The baker apologized for refusing service. Even some who'd thrown things stood and faced their shame. When the last person sat down, Mara stood. The room went silent. I accept your apologies, she said carefully. Not because what you did was excusable, but because holding on to hatred would poison me more than it would hurt you. She looked around. But I won't forget. None of us should forget how easy it was for a whole town to turn on one woman, how quickly fear became cruelty. She paused. If you really want to make this right, don't just apologize to me. Make sure it never happens again. Stand up the next time someone tries to make a scapegoat. Be better than you were. The meeting ended with promises of restitution. Mara's property would be returned, the fraudulent debts forgiven. She would receive compensation. 2 weeks after Crawford's arrest, on a warm spring day, Mara and Rowan stood in front of Marshal Garrett and witnesses. The twins wore new dresses. Rowan had shaved. Mara wore simple blue. Do you, Rowan Creed, take Mara Vale to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do, Rowan said firmly. And do you, Mara Vale, take Rowan Creed to be your lawfully wedded husband? Mara thought about everything that had led here. The humiliation, the rescue, the winter, the fight. All of it bringing her to this man and these children who'd chosen her. I do, she said. The kiss was brief and sweet, and witnessed by a town that had once tried to destroy her. The twins cheered and threw wildflowers. After the ceremony, Dutch approached with an envelope. Found this in your old cabin, hidden under a floorboard. Mara opened it to find papers in Jonah's handwriting, his evidence, and a letter to her. She read it later, alone. Jonah's words, apologizing for the danger, hoping she was safe, hoping she'd find happiness again. Live, Mara. Live fully and loudly and without apology. That's all I ever wanted for you. Mara folded the letter carefully. Jonah had wanted her to live, to be happy. And impossibly, she'd found a way. The next morning, they prepared to return to the ranch. The twins were excited to get home, to see Bear and the horses. The ride back was peaceful. Spring had fully arrived, painting the valley in green. When the ranch finally came into view, Mara felt something settle in her chest. This was home. Bear came bounding out. The twins tumbled from the wagon to embrace him. Rowan helped Mara down. Welcome home, Mrs. Creed, he said softly. It's strange, having a home again, having people who want me here. You'll get used to it. They stood in the afternoon sun watching the twins play, and Mara let herself feel what she'd been afraid to feel. Happiness. Real, uncomplicated happiness. That summer, they expanded the house, built a proper bedroom, a bigger kitchen. They were building something permanent together. One evening in late summer, a young woman showed up, thin, bruised, terrified, running from abuse. "I heard you help people," she whispered. "I heard you understand." Mara looked at this frightened woman and saw herself years ago. She opened the door wider. "Come in. You're safe here." The woman stayed 2 weeks while Marshall Garrett dealt with her situation legally. When she left, relocated safely, she hugged Mara fiercely. "Thank you for showing me it's possible to start over." "It's possible," Mara confirmed. "It's hard and scary, but it's possible." The years passed. The twins grew strong and confident. The ranch prospered. Crawford served 20 years in prison. Black Hollow slowly rebuilt itself. And Mara learned important things. That justice doesn't erase trauma, but helps. That apologies don't fix everything, but matter. That forgiveness is something you do for yourself. She learned that family isn't always blood. That strength isn't about never breaking. It's about breaking and putting yourself back together and being willing to risk it again. On a winter evening, years later, Mara sat with Rowan and the twins, now young women, playing cards by the fire. This was her life now. Simple. Occasionally boring in the best way. Nothing like she'd imagined as a young bride. Nothing like those dark years when the town tried to erase her. It was better, messier, and more real. "What are you thinking?" Rowan asked later by the dying fire. "That I survived," Mara said. "They tried to destroy me, and I survived. More than survived. I lived." "You did. And you helped others live too." "I don't know if I changed the world, but I changed my corner of it." "That counts for everything." Rowan took her hand. "You showed people you don't have to accept cruelty, that you can fight back, that you can survive and heal. That's powerful." The fire burned to embers. Outside, wind whispered through the valley. Inside, Mara Creed sat with her family and felt at peace. She'd been dragged through the dust, humiliated and hated, lost her first husband and her home. But she'd found love again, found family, found strength she didn't know she possessed. And in the end, that was victory. Not just defeating Crawford or getting justice, but refusing to let cruelty have the last word, refusing to believe the lies, refusing to accept that she deserved less. She'd survived. She'd healed. She'd loved again. The woman dragged through the dust had risen up and remade herself, had remade her family, had, in small ways, remade her corner of the frontier. She fell asleep that night in Rowan's arms, surrounded by the family they'd created. And for the first time in her entire life, Mara felt truly, completely happy. Not because everything was perfect. Life was still hard, people still complicated, but she had love, she had family, she had home, and that was what mattered most.